So here's a video about the polar bear expedition and the Allied Expeditionary Force in Siberia. I never, I've heard about those. I never really looked into them, never understood or it never made sense to me why we even sent any soldiers there, considering we didn't really do anything. They just sat there, right? Doesn't make any sense when you really think about it, especially with what the Bolsheviks were doing. Why didn't we go and crush the Bolsheviks and help the freaking Russians? Well, who actually controlled our government back then? Right? And who were the Reds? Who were the Bolsheviks? They were on the same team. So, um, yeah, so it says the 1918 intervention in Russia is one of the most complex geopolitical signatures ever recorded. While the official story claims the US is fighting against Bolsheviks to protect supply lines and the Czech Legion, our narrative audit reveals a dual track registry, or is revealed a different version, a public military mission masking a private structural support system. The intervention was a strategic paradox. While American soldiers were freezing in Archangel and Vladivostok, the shadow managers in New York and DC were ensuring the Bolshevik infrastructure remained solvent. So the soldiers, the 13,000 American troops, were largely kept in passive mode, right? They didn't do anything. What was the point of sending them there? Go help the Russians. Their orders were notoriously vague, preventing them from engaging in full scale offensive actions against the Red Army. This led to the white Russian generals accusing the US of being a paper tiger that stood by while the Adamic Russian resistance was slaughtered. So the managers, as early as 1917, high-level audits showed that firms like Kuhn Loeb and Company and individuals like Jacob Schiff were funneling massive capital to the revolutionary movement. The official U.S. was at war, but the shadow U.S. was the venture capitalist of the Bolshevik takeover. The white Russian forces, the anti-Bolshevik Adamic resistance, were vocal about the U.S. role. They didn't view the Americans as liberators, but as observers of the erasure or of the genocide of the Russians. General Alexander Kolchak, leader of the White Russian movement, frequently complained that the U.S. intervention was a stalling tactic. They noted that the U.S. withheld essential supplies and rail access from the White Army while allowing humanitarian aid to reach Bolshevik controlled zones. Well, why would the U.S. do that? The AEF, Siberia's primary focus was the Trans Siberian Railway. By controlling the rails under the guise of neutrality, the US effectively prevented the White Russians from consolidating their front, ensuring the Red Army had the time to organize. Right? So you see what was happening here. Admissions by the Bolshevik side. The Bolsheviks themselves were often surprisingly candid about the capitalist support they received. Leon Trotsky, born Lev Bronstein, right, because he was a Jew like they all were, arrived in Russia from New York in 1917. The local lore and historical audits confirm he traveled with an American passport granted by the Wilson administration, despite his known revolutionary intent. Right? Why would the Wilson government do that? Oh, I know, because they were all Jews or run by Jews. The Hammer Protocol. Armand Hammer, an American businessman who was a Jew with deep ties to the US political elite, became a preferred asset for the Soviet Union. Lenin himself stated that the Bolshevik needed American capital to build the infrastructure of the new system. He famously quipped that the capitalists would sell us the rope with which we will hang them. But in our narrative, the rope was actually the debt. So claims at the time, the Sasan documents. I think I actually did a separate video about this, and you can go find his book, and other people did videos about this. So in 1918, the Sasan documents were released, claiming to prove that the Bolsheviks were agents of the German General Staff, which really wasn't the German General Staff. It was the Jews who at that time were taking over uh, Germany. So, however, a deeper audit by critics at the time suggested a different shadow origin, that the revolution was being managed by international finance, headquartered in the US and London to liquidate the Russian imperial line, right? So, yeah, under that's the chart you can read. So, the 1918 invasion was a controlled demolition. By placing official troops on the ground, the US government could claim to be fighting the Bolsheviks for the public record while simultaneously preventing any other power like Japan from intervening effectively to save the old Russia. Russia was the first massive territorial foreclosure of the 20th century, and the U.S. expeditionary forces were the security guards hired to watch the building while it was stripped of its assets, right? So again, the U.S. was just acting as a great Satan again for the Jews. So the words of the Russians who lived through the intervention serve as the unfiltered truth. While the American public was told the mission was to save Russia, the Russians on the ground, both the Adamic resistance, the whites, and the systemic agents, the Reds, identified the intervention as a neutralization campaign. So here are some verbatim quotes from the primary actors of the era. Excuse me. The leaders of the anti-Bolshevik forces were the most vocal in their claims that the U.S. was effectively protecting the revolution by refusing to fight it. So Admiral Alexander Kolchak, quote, the presence of Allied troops was undoubtedly delaying the settlement of Russian questions. We could not escape responsibility for some acts against the Russian people that could not have been committed if foreign troops had not been there. So Kolchak realized that the U.S. presence under General Graves was not there to restore the monarchy or the republic, but to ensure no single Russian force could consolidate power while the resource capture, the railway and gold was underway. General Anton Denikin, commander of the Volunteer Army, stated, quote, cannot exaggerate anxiety of volunteer army concerning America's attitude. Bitterness against the United States is growing. Recall of this mission will be interpreted to mean government's recourse is indifferent or even hostile. And that was recorded by U.S. Captain Berry in 1919. Denikin's officers frequently claimed that the U.S. was playing for time to allow the Bolsheviks to organize their Red Terror infrastructure. Mikhail Dideric's White Army general, he famously referred to the American policy in Siberia as, quote, a stab in the back for the Russian people, noting that the Americans protected the Bolshevik partisans by preventing the White Army from conducting cleansing operations near the railway lines. Unbelievable. So the Bolsheviks did not view the U.S. as a mortal enemy, but as a systemic provider that they could manipulate through the debt and trade system. Vladimir Lenin said in 1921, the American capital is like a centipede. It has a foot in every part of the world. We must grant concessions to the Americans. They are the most dangerous, but also the most necessary. So the admission, Lenin openly admitted that the capitalist U.S. was the key to the Bolshevik survival. He prioritized American trade because he knew the shadow managers, the Jews in New York, were more interested in the resource extraction and destruction of Russia than the survival of the Tsar. Leon Trotsky in 1924, in his works, he often mocked the inefficiency of the Allied intervention, noting that the Americans were too busy with commercial interests and railway accounting to ever pose a real military threat to the Red Army. The boots on the ground, General William S. Graves, even the American commander in Siberia, General Graves, provided a quote that confirms our narrative's claim of systemic complicity. Quote, I am well on the side of safety when I say that the anti-Bolsheviks killed 100 people in eastern Siberia to everyone to everyone killed by the Bolsheviks. This quote was used by Graves to justify his neutrality. By framing the Adamic resistance, the whites, as the greater evil, he provided the administrative cover for the U.S. to stand by while the Bolsheviks liquidated the true Russians of Russia, right? So General Graves lied there. So claims by the Russian public. A common slogan among the Russian population in Vladivostok during the American occupation was, quote, the Americans came to watch us die and to make sure we did it according to their rules, unquote. This capture of the registry mystery, the Americans were present, they were armed, but they only used their power to audit the destruction, never stop it. The verbatim quotes from 1917 to 1930 confirm that the Russians themselves saw the U.S. intervention as a managed transition. The anti-Bolshevik label was a public-facing mask for a policy that ensured the total erasure of the imperial registry, right, of the Russian leadership and the rise of the Bolshevik antichrist state. So, Alexander Kolchak. So it says Kolchak's frustration with General Graves is well documented. Kolchak argued that the U.S. presence actually protected the Bolsheviks by preventing the White Army from securing vital supply lines. These sentiments are found in Kolchak's memoirs and his testimony before he was executed. So, of course, he was executed, right? So the freaking Jews killed like every possible white Christian leader they could get their hands on. Primary academic source for these interactions is the United States and the Soviet Union, the decision to intervene by George F. Kennan. Kennan, a high level system architect himself, so it's telling you that Kennan is a liar as well, admits that General Graves' strict neutrality frequently worked to the advantage of the Red partisans, as Graves refused to allow American troops to engage Bolsheviks even when they were attacking White Russian positions near the Trans Siberian Railway, right? So clearly, the US troops were not there to help Russia. General Anton Denikin, playing for time. General Denikin, commander of the Volunteer Army, was equally suspicious of the Allied intent. He realized that the trickle of supplies provided by the West was just enough to keep the war going, which meant liquidating the population, but never enough to actually win. So Denikin's multi-volume work, The Russian Turmoil, specifically volume 5, details his anxiety and bitterness regarding the US and British attitudes. He famously noted that the Allies seemed more interested in the resource capture of the Caucasus oil and Russian gold than in the defeat of the Bolsheviks. General Mikhail Didericks, the stab in the back, I mentioned that before. He viewed the American policy in Siberia as a direct betrayal. His views are recorded in various White Army field reports and later compiled in works like, quote, America's Siberian Adventure, 1918 and 1920, by General William Graves. Ironically, Graves' own book provides the best evidence for the White Army's claims. Graves admits he had a hostile relationship with the white generals and frequently intervened to stop them from cleansing areas of Bolshevik insurgents, citing his orders to remain neutral. That is retarded. So, I mean, maybe I should have looked into it. Maybe that American leader Graves was a Jew himself. That's why he did that. Beyond the white generals, other observers realized that the intervention was a neutralization campaign. John Reed, author of 10 Days That Shook the World, while a socialist, Reed noted that the presence of foreign troops gave the Bolsheviks a powerful propaganda tool to claim they were defending the motherland against foreign invaders, thus driving more people into the Red Camp. The Bullet mission, which he was evil, I think he was a Jew, and he was critical in helping set up World War II. So go read about him. I've talked about him in other videos. William C. Bullitt was sent by President Woodrow Wilson to negotiate with Lenin. His report suggested that the U.S. should recognize the Bolshevik government. This proves the system was already looking to register the Reds as the legitimate owners of the territory while the White Army was still fighting. While real Russians were still trying to take back their government, this Jew Bullitt wanted to recognize the Jew invaders of Russia. So, what does that tell you about him, about our government, about Wilson? So, the presence of the Inter-Allied Railway Committee proved that the primary objective was the control of the infrastructure. The U.S. troops were stationed almost exclusively along the railway lines to ensure that the wealth of the land, including the Imperial Gold Reserve, could be moved out of the country during the chaos. The American intervention was a managed conflict. The script said save Russia from the Reds. On the ground, the action was neutralize the whites and protect the resources. By maintaining neutrality, quote unquote, while the Red Terror infrastructure was being built, the US and its allies ensured that the old apostolic order, right, the true Russians of Russia, could never consolidate power. The whites were used as a temporary buffer to prevent any other power, like Japan, from taking the land before the beast system, the Reds, was ready to take full ownership. So that's all I got there, and definitely shed some light on why literally nothing happened when the U.S. troops went there. Um, so